The topography of a story, by which I mean the field of possibilities on which the narrative actually plays out, consists of three essential elements. First, there's the inheritance of the past. These are the structures, historical, sociological, religious, biological, that we've received from the world which was. Then there's the landscape of the present. Now that can be actual geography, but in my eyes, what's most important are the questions. Those driving issues of the day that give energy to the society in which we're living now. Then, of course, there's the visions of the future, those dreams and aspirations and frameworks by which we understand our past and we guide our behavior in the present. And when we look at these three pieces of topography, it's fairly obvious where maps fall out. They're the ultimate inheritance of the past. The boundary lines that are drawn on maps represent geopolitical realities that were often changing even as they were drawn. Nevertheless, I see them as a critical piece underlying the Jewish story. In the next few minutes, I want to take a whirlwind tour through world history and check out 6 different maps that underlie the Jewish story. By the way, when I say the Jewish story, I'm not just talking about the story of Jewish history. I'm talking about my popular podcast that tells a story of the past, which is looking to create a people in the present that's oriented toward the future that we all want to live. So sit back for just a few minutes and join me in exploring the topography, the 6 maps that underlie the Jewish story. Map 1, the Fertile Crescent. You know, on some level, the Jewish story is the human story. This is as old as it gets. And that's why, in my eyes, a map of the Fertile Crescent, the cradle of civilization, really belongs at the base of our story. But remember, this is more than just a story of humanity. It's a story about the love between creator and creation. And so when we follow Avram Avinu, our father Abraham, on his particular journey from Ur-Kasdim up to Haran and all the way over to Canaan land, to the land of Israel, what we're seeing there is a story about someone with the conceptual courage, the ability to stand on the other side from the whole world and say, no, there are no idols and false gods. There's only one God. And his story is a story of crafting the vessels that can hold that relationship. We call it Brit, covenant. And there will be a Torah that comes down with his descendant Moshe at Sinai. And there will be a people that are born out of the Exodus from Egypt, both of which will serve as vessels for that covenant. But for right now, this map tells us that the first vessel that hold the relationship between Abraham and God, between creator and created, was the land. And that's why I see the Fertile Crescent as the base of the topography for the Jewish story. Map 2, the Kingdom of Israel. It says in Bamidbar, in Numbers 23:9, that Israel was meant to be a people that dwells alone. Well, I don't know about you, but if I were God, so to speak, and I wanted to make a people that dwelt alone, I'd put them in Antarctica, the Gobi Desert. I wouldn't drop them at the crossroads of the ancient world. But from this map, you can see that's exactly where Israel ended up. Whether it was the tribal lands that were conquered by Joshua, or whether it was the Davidic kingdom united over this region, or whether it was the divided kingdom of Israel in the north and Judah in the south, all the generations of the embodiment of the Jewish people of Am Yisrael in the land of Israel sit right between the world's empires, Egypt and Assyria, Greece and Persia, the Ptolemaic and the Seleucid, the Romans and the Parthians, and read the news. We're still there now. And this is an important part of the topography of the Jewish story because it makes us one part geopolitical keystone, one part cultural bridge, and one part the whipping boy of empires. And if you want to understand the topography of the Jewish story, then you have to know what it looks like to be a nation that dwells alone right at the crossroads of the world. Map 3, the Cosmographia. What you're looking at here is the Cosmographia. It's a gazetteer, atlas, and cartographic treatise written by Claudius Ptolemy in the year 150 of the Common Era. I mean, the atlas as a whole is huge. It's got a world map and dozens of regional maps. You're seeing here the representation of what we today call the Middle East. And if you're looking closely, then you might have noticed that Israel, or Judea as it was known in the Roman period, just isn't there. And that's no accident. You see, because the Romans by this point had already wiped Judea off the map. It happened at the end of the Bar Kokhba revolt, the third of the 3 Roman Jewish wars. If you don't know the story, that's fine. Go back to season 1 and listen for the details. For now, all you need to know is that for nearly 100 years, the Judeans fought to prove to Rome that we were the indigestible element of empire, that our knee would never bow to foreign rule in our land. Well, for better or worse, we lost. And when the Emperor Hadrian decided that enough was enough, after 3 wars there would be no more, he knew it wasn't enough just to beat the Jews. It wasn't even enough just to uproot Judaism by banning circumcision, learning the Torah, the Sabbath, and the festivals. He knew he had to get rid of Judea altogether. And that's why he made a decree to change the name of the province from Judea to Palestina, and thus wiped the Judeans off the map. And in doing so, it was a critical moment in transforming our national identity from national, landed, to abstract and religious. Now, who could know that at the time this would be a devastating blow? As you may be aware, today there's a big argument about whether I live in Israel or in Palestine. And from that very fact, you can understand why the Cosmographia, which was translated first into Arabic in the 9th century, and then into Latin in the 15th, and served as the basis for knowledge of geography all the way through the early modern era, is a critical piece of the topography that underlies the Jewish story. Maps 4 and 5. Now, it wouldn't be a Jewish story if there were only 6 maps in the 6 maps that make up the Jewish story. So here are 2 maps which work together to give you another piece of the topography which underlies the Jewish story. The first is a picture of the meteoric rise of Islam. In the 7th century, the followers of Muhammad spread out from the Arabian Peninsula, and within nearly 100 years, Dar al-Islam, the world of Islam, stretched from the Indus Valley on the east all the way to the Iberian Peninsula on the west. They contained at their height 90% of world Jewry, uniting the Jews under one empire and one linguistic umbrella in a way in which we've never really seen since. During the Middle Ages, this provoked an incredible flowering of culture. Back then, it was good news for the Jews to live in the world of Islam. So that's one map you see here. The other map is the Uppsala map. It's a Crusader map drawn in the 12th century. And when you look at it, I want you to take 2 lessons about the topography of the Jewish story. The first is cultural appropriation. You know, for some reason, it's perfectly legitimate to take things away from the Jews and claim them as your own. And here you see Jerusalem, the heart of Jewish culture. It's a Christian city meant to be liberated from the Islamic infidels. The Jews are nowhere in sight. That's one piece. The second piece is what happens when you put the Uppsala map together with the Dar al-Islam, the map of the world of Islam. What you get there is a titanic battle. You know, Christianity and Islam have been fighting a battle back and forth all the way through the Middle Ages into the early modern era. And if you're paying attention to the news, then you know that at this point in time, just in the midst of our current phase of national rebirth, that war is heating up again. And that's why, put together, these 2 maps are a key piece of the topography which underlies the Jewish story. Map 6, the Cloverleaf. If you've wandered the modern city of Jerusalem any time in the last 20 or 30 years, you've seen this map before. Its reproduction is on the wall right outside of City Hall. It's the Bunting Cloverleaf map, drawn by German Protestant pastor and cartographer Heinrich Bunting in 1581. Now, the world had just recently been circumnavigated, and you can see almost all the continents are there. Poor Australia, she always gets left out at this phase. This is an iconic image from the dawn of global era, and Jerusalem is at its center. Meanwhile, we know that the Jews are scattered to every corner of the globe that this represents. And if you've been a listener of the Jewish story for a while, you may remember Rabbi Menashe ben Israel, whose great hope was that dispersion to the 4 corners of the globe meant that the punishment of Israel had finally come to an end, and that the ingathering could begin. So that's what I want you to take from this picture. It's one world. Jerusalem lies at its center, and even though the Jews are scattered far and wide, and it will be 300 years before Menashe ben Israel's hope can become a movement toward reality, nonetheless, the Jews turn back to that center to pray 3 times a day for redemption. And that's why, in my eyes, the Cloverleaf map is an important piece of the topography underlying the Jewish story. Map 7, the Sykes-Picot Agreement. Now, there are any number of maps that I could have included in this video, and you know a storyteller largely by where he begins and where he ends. So here is the Sykes-Picot Agreement. It's a map that I feel really underlies the current phase of the Jewish story. Because, it's a favorite tactic of Israel's detractors to claim that we are a colonial entity planted by Europe in the heart of the Arab Middle East. I hope, after having seen the previous maps, you have a sense that it's a tough sell to claim that the Jews are foreigners to this region. Nevertheless, this map does tell the truth of how colonialism plays a very important part in our story. Sykes-Picot was an agreement struck between the United Kingdom and France in 1916 to carve up the Ottoman Empire, even before they conquered it in World War I. And for our story, what it represents is the colonial and post-colonial era. You've got to understand how this region was first brutally conquered, then shamelessly divided, and then ruthlessly manipulated in order to meet the needs of people who weren't from here. And even today, many of those powers are playing out their post-colonial guilt in once again a desire to rearrange the borders of a region in which they have no real stake. But that's a story that lies ahead, because we're heading into seasons of Jewish Story, and I want to invite you to join me, not just in listening back, but in moving forward. If you want to listen to the first 2 seasons and the unfolding of Season 3, you can go to my website at www.jewishstory.co. You can find me on Twitter at The Jewish Story. You can find me on Facebook at The Jewish Story Podcast, or you can shoot me an email at ravmikefoyer@gmail.com. Any way you look at it, I want you to tune in and be part of the story. And if you get enthusiastic, I invite you to join me in making a little bit of history. There on the website, in the upper right-hand corner, you'll see a button that says Be a Patron. You can click there in order to give a little bit of per-podcast support. But whether you become a listener or a supporter, one thing I ask you is this: to join me in telling a story of the past that can help to build the people in the present who are motivated to create the future of which we dream. I'm Rav Mike Foyer, and this is The Jewish Story.